I always wanted for there to be this place where people could explore and investigate who Jesus is, what the claims of Christianity are, could explore and investigate what the Bible means, and the questions that they have. All over churches, all over the world, all over the United States this morning, there will be messages preached, and they will be very similar to what they've heard for the last 25 years when they went there. It's sort of like a soap opera. Anybody here ever watch soap operas? I didn't watch soap operas, but every now and then when I was a kid, the person that watched me, my Aunt Jerry, watched soap operas. And then it seems like my wife did for a little while. Hey, Jeannie, didn't you used to watch soap operas? Like The Young and the Restless. And here's been it happened years and years ago. I found The Young and Restless somewhere, and the same thing, Nikki and Victor were doing the same thing that they had done 20 years ago. And it's very similar. You go into a church and you're going to hear the same message. You're bad. Jesus came, and because you were so bad, he died for your sins. If you believe that, you'll go to heaven. If you don't, you'll go to hell. Have a nice day. But there's millions and millions and millions of people. And this is what I began to discover years ago, and it became something that's really, it's where my heart is. That there are millions of people who would love to believe, but they have so many questions and so many obstacles that are keeping them from approaching God. And they see various Christians, like there was a couple guys out at the intersection the other night, and it was dark, and they had this sign, and they had holding up a cross, and they were preaching at the intersection as you were turning left and talking about Jesus died for your sins or whatever. And there's so many people that think, well, if that's what a Christian is, if I have to do that, I don't want to be involved. So I always wanted there to be a place where we could explore and investigate questions. So that's what we're going to do today. And it's just a very relaxed thing, Jesus Talk is. But if you have questions, now I have some questions that people have sent in. And I made a social media post I guess it was last week. And I just simply said, if you have, what is it that has always bothered you about God or Jesus, the concept of God or Jesus or the Bible? And if Jesus himself appeared in front of you, if Jesus walked in today and said, okay, I got 5 minutes, what's the thing that you would really like to know? Hit me with it. And so some people sent in some questions. And this is what I was going to say, by the way, a while ago. One reason that we do what we do, and it's a much trimmed down version, of course, but there's so many questions that people have that there's nowhere you can go to find a good answer, in my not so humble opinion. And so what we're doing every time that we gather like this is we're creating a video resource, a video library that we eventually want to use, or I eventually want to use, to be able to distribute, to be able to share all over the world, because there's millions and millions of people that cannot find the answers that they're looking for. And so that's why we're here today. But if you have a question, go back to that first slide there. In the four Gospels, which are the accounts of Jesus' life, Jesus himself asks 307 questions. It's one of his favorite ways to teach. It's my favorite thing to do. If people didn't ask him a question, which they often did, oh, I don't have my clicker. What in the world will we do? Huh?
Is that a question?
No, that was Joe is. You have a question? Okay. Yeah? At the point of death, what happens to the soul? Okay. We will talk about that question in this series of questions, because that's a great question. A lot of people have that. Marty's question was, at the point of death, what happens to what she's terming the soul? So I'm going to set that aside and we'll get to that. And with one of these other questions, we may sort of answer that. But Jesus asked 307 questions. People ask him 183 questions. Not all at once, but in the 4 accounts, we have 183 questions. But Jesus, one of his favorite ways to teach is he pops a question out there. He says to his disciples, who do people say that I am? That's how he starts his, and so then they interact with him. It's not just sit there and let me download information. Of those 183 questions, some of you may have seen my post about this. Of those 183 questions, how many do you think that Jesus just answered? 3. Out of 183 times where someone asks him a question, he just directly answers 3 times. Most of the times, he answers with another question. When the Pharisees challenge him, at times he says, okay, if you'll answer this, I'll answer your question. And then they wouldn't answer his, so he says, I won't answer yours, and just walks away. So, one of my favorite questions that he doesn't answer, most frustrating question, is Pilate looks directly at him and says, what is truth? Because that's one of the biggest questions that people have in life. What is truth? And he doesn't answer him. Okay, but if I'm saying this because sometimes people get frustrated with me. They're like, I ask you a question, and now I have 6 more questions, and I don't know the answer to the first question I asked. That is the process of learning. That is the process of relationship with Jesus. It's not about having all the right answers. It's about actually expanding your brain and seeing that there's more ways to look at things, perhaps than yours. But if you have a question here, as Miss Marty just did, you can just pop up, raise your hand, and we'll talk about it. Or if you're watching online, or if you're here and you would like to be more anonymous, you can text to this number right here, 415-SB-ROCKS. And I'll get a text, or Joe will get a text. Sometimes it works different ways for some reason. And we'll add that to the list. Okay, here's the question that we're going to start with that a person sent in to me. And I just really appreciate this person really seemed sincere, and he said some other things to me in this message. But he said, I'd like to ask why I have such a hard time believing. I do try to believe in God, but I quickly talk myself into not believing. This question is not to challenge you on why God is real or not. I struggle with this and would really like your opinion. Thanks. Okay, so I've been pretty honest over the years with my struggle with belief. I occasionally, there's never a week that goes by that a very serious thought or feeling hits me that everything that I believe about God, about like Marty was asking, what happens at the point of death? There's times it hits me. A lot of times when I'm going to sleep and I'm closing my eyes and I think about, well, there's going to be a day when my eyes close for the final time. And so you're telling me that there's somewhere else that this real person in me, is going to go? And so I am not afraid to question that. I'm not afraid to doubt that. But this is something that I struggle with. And this is something that Christianity in general, churches in general, do not have a tolerance for. For a person saying, hey, I don't believe this. Well, you're not going to fit in or be very comfortable in that group of people from that point on. Because most Christians will do everything they can to almost force you into believing and warning you of the consequences of not believing. But this is the thing when we first started Stoneberg, and it made a lot of Christians upset, but it also caused a lot of atheists to accept this story of who Jesus is I've always said, you don't have to believe to be here. You can belong before you believe. If you never believe what I believe or what we collectively believe, it's perfectly fine. So that's my first thing to say to someone that says, hey, I'm having a hard time believing. Why am I having such a hard time? I want you to know you don't ever have to. I don't have dire warnings. If you don't, we may even talk about that a little bit later. But it's to me, believing, and I'm going to show you some things as to why I believe. I'm not going to tell you why you should believe. I'm going to tell you why I still believe that there's a God, why I believe Jesus existed, why I believe he died on a cross and he rose from the dead. That's the big thing. Why I believe that. I'm not saying I don't ever doubt that, because I do. There's times where my logical brain says, are you kidding me?
Are you kidding me?
This is what you believe. But I'm going to tell you why. But you need to know that you don't have to. It's a lot like falling in love. Anybody ever fallen in love before? Like I fell in love. And I don't know why. I really don't. My wife and I have this conversation a lot. Jeannie and I, we are very authentic in our conversations, and it's a big deal to me to just, I don't have a secret from her. There's nothing about me that she does not know. But I'll say to her every now and then, I have no idea why I'm in love with you. And I can give you lots of reasons why I don't want to be anywhere near this woman at this particular moment. You know what I mean? But I always come back to, I don't know. I fell in love with her. I didn't try, okay? Like he's saying, and I understand. I do try to believe in God. Stop that. Stop that immediately. It's a relationship. Now, I'm going to tell you some things about him, but I'm only interested in a loving relationship with God. I'm not interested in, so if I don't do this exactly right, I'm going to be tortured eternally? Wow, okay, sign me up. Now, how is this person love me? And we'll talk about that maybe some more later. But for a starter, just stop trying. And here's something that I've done. And this is just me. I'm kind of strange, but I think there's a lot of people that don't think that this is possible to be a Christian. I've spent the last 20 years trying to become an atheist. It's just my nature. Everything that I believe about anything, I challenge it. I poke holes at it. I want it to be true. I want it to be right. So I look at it from every perspective, and I try to assault every single thing I believe. And I've honestly tried. I've read so many atheists. I've listened to so many atheists, not in the traditional sense that Christians do, where they're trying to discount everything they say. I'm wanting them to give me some information that will change the way I think about who God is. And I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in atheists. All they're doing, any atheist I've ever seen, they're simply agreeing with the fact, with me, that Christians in general have misunderstood who God is, what the Bible is, and what the purpose of Jesus coming to the earth. So there's that. So here's what I say to this person, number one, is I've tried for years to not be a believer, but I've become convinced because of certain things, and now I'm going to share some of them with you. Okay. You guys okay?
Yeah.
Are you getting warmer?
No.
You're not getting warmer? I'm actually warmer. I'm going to take off my coat. I'd like a little music. No, just kidding. Now I have static clinging on my shirt. Okay. Here's the first thing I say when someone says, I really like to believe, but I can't. Here's something from the account of Jesus' life. But very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. What is this a story about? You Bible scholars? What? This is Sunday morning, a day and a half after Jesus was crucified on a Saturday evening. The women that knew him are going to the place where he was buried, because they looked and saw where he was buried, and they're taking spices. Why? Marty is shouting from the other side of the wall, to prepare his what?
Body.
To prepare his body. Which means that they believe what?
That he's dead.
They believe he's dead. There's no one, and I say this a lot, there's no one at the tomb on Sunday morning gathered around the stone, holding hands, counting down. 10, 9, 8. He's about to come out. This is going to be awesome. It just doesn't happen. The only people that are there are the women. All the men aren't even bothering to go to the tomb. But the women respect Jesus so much. He's been crucified. He meant so much to them. And they know that the people that took him off the cross were two dudes, Joseph and Nicodemus, and that they didn't do it right. So they're going to go back to the tomb on Sunday morning because they had to rest on Saturday, which is the Sabbath, to prepare his body because his body is dead. They've been with this person for 3.5 years. This person has told them repeatedly, I'm going to be killed and I'm going to rise again on the third day. He has told them this. And none of them, after spending 3 years with the man himself, none of them believed him. None of them. They found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance, so they went in. But they didn't find the body of Jesus. And so they said, oh my Jesus, he's risen from the dead. No. As they stood there, puzzled. I wonder what happened. None of them said, remember when he said he would rise from the dead? I bet that's what happened. None of them. I'm going to emphasize that a lot. Two men suddenly appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes. And I get this picture of just these guys almost with pimp coats on. And that's not the way it is. It's like, wow, those are really sick robes you got on there, dude. No, it just means there's some sort of angelic being probably. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. Then the men asked, why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive? He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Okay? That's quite a big thing to lay on somebody. You have to understand that we as Christians, as Jesus followers, have this foundational belief that there was a person that was alive about 2,000 years ago. He was executed by the Roman government in cahoots with the Jewish leadership, but he's not still dead. That's the basis of our belief. When you say, I have a hard time believing, yeah, that's hard to believe. They said, remember what he told you back in Galilee? That the Son of Man, that's the term Jesus used for himself, must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and that he would rise again on the third day. So these people were told directly by the person, and they didn't believe it. And then they remembered. They didn't even remember it. This gives me comfort because I prepare all kinds of messages and people don't even remember it. But Jesus himself said, I'm going to rise on the third day. The first part happened. He was crucified. I don't know why they didn't say, hey, he said that was going to happen. And look, it happened. But they did not even connect the dots that, hey, maybe the second part will happen. They didn't even remember it. Okay? So they rushed back. It gets better. They rushed back from the tomb to tell his 11 disciples, because Judas has killed himself, and everyone else. There were other people besides the disciples that hung around with him. What happened? It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and several other women who were also named Mary for some reason, who told the apostles what had happened. But the story sounded like nonsense, so they didn't believe it. My first thing when someone says, I have a hard time believing, what's my problem? Nothing. Here are people that supposedly travel around with Jesus. They've seen him heal people. They've seen him walk on water. They've seen him take 5 loaves and 2 fish and feed 5,000 people. They saw him walk up to a tomb and say, Lazarus, who had been dead for 4 days, come out of there. And he came back from the dead. They've witnessed all kinds of miracles. and someone simply saying, hey, he's not dead, he's risen from the dead, we saw some angels and they said he's gone. That sounded like nonsense to those people. Why would it not sound like nonsense to you? They didn't believe it. Well, why would it be such a hard thing for us to accept, hey, this person is having a hard time believing? I never experienced one time in my upbringing in church or other churches I've been where there was any understanding from the leadership or other Christians concerning somebody who was an atheist or someone who was an agnostic who just didn't know they were having a hard time believing. I've never heard any Christian express compassion toward them to say, well, duh, it's a big thing to believe. They would say things like, you just got to believe, and didn't really give reasons why. So, however, Peter jumped up, he ran to the tomb to look. Stooping, he peered in and saw the empty linen wrappings. Then he went home, wondering what had happened. See, these people that we hold up as these pillars of holiness, they weren't necessarily the sharpest tools in the shed. And I'm not putting them down because people that have died don't come back to life. That's just one of the rules that we all go by. So he's wondering what had happened. If you're having a hard time believing, I simply want you to know, wondering is part of it. It's just part of the process. So what I'm going to do now is not tell you what to do or try to convince you of anything. And when I say you, anybody that's watching this, anybody that's here that may have the same experience of, I don't know if this is true or not. I'm simply going to tell you some reasons I believe. This is why I believe. These are the processes that I have gone through to be reasonably convinced. I won't be completely convinced until I either die and nothing happens. And what bothers me then is I can't even go, oh, I guess I was wrong. I won't even know. Or I stand before Jesus himself and he says, I told you. See? Okay? So here we go. I'm going to take it from a different standpoint. And this is a little bit of a roundabout way, and I don't know that I've heard people say this, but this is my process, okay? So you made the mistake of coming here. You'll just have to listen. The Apostle Paul, and here's what I go through. I go with what I know and where there's a consensus among scholars and many times secular scholars or historians. There's a guy named Paul, I don't know his last name, of Tarsus. The Hebrew version of his name is Saul. And Saul, who is his Greek name, which he used because he was trying to reach out to people who were not Jewish. So he goes by Paul. If I was in a Latin country, I would go by Marcos. But I won't do that here. Unless you want to start calling me that, because it makes me sound cooler than I am. But the Apostle Paul went around the Mediterranean rim, sort of southwest Asia, and into South Europe, and he started churches. He went around to people who were Greeks and told them, hey, there's this guy. He lived in Israel. He preached about what God was like, and he performed miracles. He was killed, and he rose from the dead. And for whatever reason, people believed that and began to gather in these little groups that we call churches. They were simply gatherings. That's a fact. See, this is where I start. I always want to start from, well, there's a fact. I can look out at the universe and say, well, something had to create that. I don't know. I don't have data. I don't have factual things for that. But I do have a fact that I can look and say, those things happened historically. Everybody agrees that the message of Christianity, the religion, if you will, of Christianity spread so quickly. It's just unbelievable how the message of who Jesus is spread through the world at that time, the Roman Empire. And Paul started these churches. Boom, fact. Paul wrote 13 letters to those churches after he left them to go start other churches, addressing various things that they were having difficulty with. Of those 13 letters, 7 of them are agreed universally that these are authentically written by Paul. Okay? The others, I believe, were written by Paul, but you would be so bored, more bored than you already are, if I told you why. But so I'm about to read something where Paul, everybody agrees, Paul was a historical person. He actually wrote these letters. And we're going to talk about what we know, and everybody agrees about Paul and his story. But Paul says that I passed on to you, this church. He's writing to a small gathering of people just like this, and they get the letter, somebody stands up to read, and he says, I passed on to you what was most important. Now, it helps to understand that the people in Corinth were having trouble with the concept that there would be a resurrection someday. Marty, a while ago, asked a question about what happens at the point of death, and that's a great, great, great question. But the most people of that time were mainly fascinated. The Hebrews expected this in some way, but the rest of the world was fascinated by this idea that someday we'll come back to life. Again, if you're having a hard time believing, that's a hard thing to believe. And so the people in Corinth were having a hard time believing that. And so Paul begins to answer that question. And he says, I passed on to you what was most important. Now, there are several times in these Corinthian letters where Paul uses this format, this motif, if you will. I passed on to you what was passed on to me. Now, this is important, and this may feel sort of like a seminary class, and if you can stick through it, you'll really see something here. Paul is explaining, he's about to share sort of a hymn, H-Y-M-N, or a chant that was used in the ancient world, in first century Palestine and the Roman Empire, with people who were basically, for the most part, illiterate. The way for them to memorize things was by a certain chant. I can't think of any at the moment that we use to teach things. Well, like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, everybody knows their ABCs. There's no reason, by the way, that they need to be in that order. It's just something that I remember Big Bird singing, Abkadefki Jekyllmanopquerstuvixes.
Abkadefki Jekyllmanopquerstuvixes.
Do you know what that is? That's what A, B, C, D, E, F, G spells. That's the word, Abkadefki Jekyllmanopquerstuvixes.
It's the most remarkable word I've ever seen.
Well, there's certain things that you remember with these chants. I used to have to, when I would look up in the Bible, I would have to sing Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua and Judges, Ruth and Samuel, Kings, Heath, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. So they put it into a song so you could remember it. This is what Paul is about to share. Something like that. He said, I passed on to you what was most important. So if you wanted to believe, this is the most important thing. And what has also been passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the scriptures said. I'm not going to get into the fact that the scriptures don't actually say that. Just don't pay attention to that. He was buried, and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the scripture said. See, it has a little poetry, it has a little repetition to it. Now, he says he was seen by Peter and then by the 12. The 12 are his other disciples. It's very interesting, side note, that he doesn't mention that the women were actually the first people that saw him. He goes straight to Peter saw him. Well, the women saw him first. So he was seen by Peter, boom, 1. Then by the 12 disciples, boom, there's 2. After that, he was seen by more than 500 of his followers, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. See, here's, if you want to get technical that the Bible is literal, that's not true right there. Most of them aren't still alive. They've all died. But at that particular time, Paul is using this reasoning, this supporting evidence to say, Most of these people are still alive. You can talk to them. This isn't something we just made up. These people say they saw him. Go talk to him. But some of them is dead. Then he was seen by James. This is the brother of Jesus. I'm contractually obligated to say, what would it take for your brother to convince you that he is God? Well, if you saw him die and he rose from the dead, James became a follower of Jesus, even though we know when Jesus was alive, James did not believe that Jesus was anything more than a dude that I used to play soccer with. They probably didn't play soccer. But anyway, James believes he was seen alive after he was dead, and later by all the apostles. Now here's important. Here's where I'm going. And it looks like I'm going to take the whole time to do this. Last of all, this is Paul talking. As though I had been born at the wrong time, I also saw him. Paul is making the claim that he saw Jesus alive. Paul is probably 10 to 12 years younger than Jesus. He did not see him while Jesus was alive in the flesh. He did not live in Israel. He's from Tarsus. He's a Jewish man that lived in another city in the Roman Empire. But Paul is saying, I also saw him. He says, for I am the least of all the apostles. In fact, I'm not even worthy to be called an apostle after the way I persecuted God's church. This is really important because I'm going to tell you a story from the book of Acts. And it's not just a story that the writer of the book of Acts made up. We have corroborating evidence that all scholars and historians agree are authentically, historically from a guy named Paul that says, yes, this is what I did. So I'm just presenting my case. You're, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. You're the one that makes the decision. I persecuted the church. But then he makes this statement. If Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. And so here is the crux of the entire matter. The only thing that you have to decide, is this true or is this not true? And when I say have to, you don't have to, but if you're interested in believing in God, there's all kinds of reasons swirling around. Well, you know, it's the Big Bang and there's probably multi-universes. I don't know, maybe. But the foundation, the pinpoint, the crossroads that Christianity itself gives you is, if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, then all our preaching, the rest of the Bible, throw that away. Just don't pay attention to that. All the apostles' preaching is worthless if Jesus didn't raise from the dead. So this is where, because of this, this is where I have focused my search in, do I believe this or not? Okay? Now, Paul writing to another church in Galatia. This is one of the 7 letters that all the scholars agree are authentic. He said, I received my message from no human. By the way, let me just stop. Do you have questions about anything I've said besides, why are you talking about this? Okay. I received my message from no human source, and no one taught me. Instead, I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ. Now let me say just a little bit about this, because Paul, in the little passage we just talked about, Paul said, I passed on to you what was passed on to me. Boom, I got it. I shoveled it to you. This is me thinking about the Kansas City game. I'm going to lateral to you. So that's what Paul did. He learned something, because he says, no one taught me. Kind of. He's going to go on to say in this letter, well, you know, I talked to some of the other apostles, but they didn't disagree with anything I was already teaching. They basically confirmed it. The big question. When did the earliest Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead? When did they believe that? Skeptics, which I am, But skeptics, atheists will say that the story of Jesus actually rising from the dead was developed later. Historians, when they look back at what is true, talk about the time period between when the event happened and when it was written about. Almost everybody believes that Alexander the Great did the things that he said he did. The earliest writings we have of that are about 400 years after the event. So there's time then for legend to develop. Like maybe he was just Alexander the above average. But by 400 years later, he was Alexander the Great. Some of the events that happened have been embellished. But it doesn't mean the event didn't happen. And so everybody believes the event happened. Things of Caesar, George Washington. We have more evidence for certain things concerning Jesus than we do of so many historical characters that are simply accepted as fact. But here's the question. How early did the Christian church believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead? Did they immediately believe that? Because the writings, like I just shared with you, and I'll maybe have to get to this next time, where Luke tells the story that they didn't believe, that it sounded like nonsense to them. How soon was that written? It wasn't written. Jesus died around 30 AD, CE. Okay, around 30. He was born probably 6, and he may have even been crucified a little before that, but I've decided, and I won't go through the arduous process of telling you why I've decided, but he was about 30 AD, Jesus died. When were the stories of him dying and raising from the dead written? And if they were written, let's say 20 years later, well, that gives some time for legend to develop. Yeah, he was a good guy. Yeah, these amazing things happened. He did wonderful works. But raised from the dead, well, it's been a long time since he did that, and this person, and they're embellishing it. That is the argument. So one reason I'm going through this is to show you how early Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead, because Paul said, they told me this, and I'm passing it on to you. The question is, when did Paul know? And I'm about to show you. See, all over churches, all over the world, nobody's going to talk about this today. But you just, unfortunately, landed in this one. So, he said, I received it directly from Jesus. He said, you know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion, how I violently persecuted God's church. I did my best to destroy it. We're going to eventually see a story in Acts which talks about Paul doing that and then what happened to him after it. Here is Paul, 2 different letters confirming, yep, that's me. It's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. I persecuted the church.
I'm the problem, it's me.
He said, I was far ahead of my fellow Jews in my zeal for the traditions of my ancestors. Paul was very enthusiastic and passionate about the Jewish religion, which said a human being can never be God. If you even suggest it, we're going to kill you. Okay? He was zealous about it. That's what it says. He persecuted the church because they were saying, this human being, he's God. Here is also another proof that it happened very early, because the reason that Paul was going around killing the Christians is not because they were meeting on Sunday instead of Saturday. It's not because they sang rock and roll instead of country. It's simply because these people were saying, this human being, Jesus of Nazareth, rose from the dead. That is blasphemy. When Jesus even suggested at his trial, he called himself the Son of Man, and he said, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. He's referencing an Old Testament story speaking of God himself, and the high priest ripped his clothes and said, we don't need to hear anything else. He's worthy of death. That's what Paul is doing. These people believe that, so I'm going to kill them, because that's my job as a Jewish person. He was doing that about 2-ish, 3 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. There's one reason that they had to have been believing it early, or Paul would have had no reason to try to kill them if they weren't propagating this idea that Jesus is God. Okay? But even before I was born, God called me by his marvelous grace. Then it pleased him to reveal his Son to me, so that I would proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. So Paul had this experience. We'll eventually get to that. When this happened, I did not rush out to consult with any human being. I didn't go up to Jerusalem to consult with those who were apostles before I was. Instead, I went into Arabia, the desert, and later I returned to the city of Damascus. So get the timeline, and we'll eventually look at what happened in Acts. Jesus is crucified, and I don't know if we'll look at it today, but Stephen is martyred. He's stoned because he's saying certain things about the Jewish people. Saul is there. Saul goes about persecuting the church. It's about 3 years after the crucifixion, and he, according to his testimony, encounters a risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. He spends a little bit of time in Arabia. It's not very long. He just goes in the desert. Let me sort this out. So I don't know. Let's give it a year. Let's say he's in the desert a year. We don't know for sure. We know it wasn't very long because of the book of Acts. Then 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem to get to know Peter. We have an account of this in Acts. So 5, 6 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, Paul goes to Jerusalem and meets Peter, and he stayed with him for 15 days. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. That's all I can say. Paul and Peter just spent a little time having some discussions. The only other apostle I met at that time was James, the Lord's brother. This is one reason Paul can say in 1 Corinthians 15, he appeared first to Peter, and then James saw him. That's how he knows. Peter and James are telling him. Okay? At that time, it seems that it was passed on to him what he passed on to the Corinthians. When Paul said, it was passed on to me, and I passed it on to you. At this time, 5, 6, 7 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, it was already an established hymn. It's already been put into the curriculum. They've had to take some time to develop this. They didn't say, okay, we got to teach this. I got a song. No, that had to develop over time. So sometime prior to 5 or 6 years after Jesus was crucified, it had already been codified into curriculum that this is what we believe about him. He rose from the dead. Peter saw him. James saw him. 500 saw him. All these people saw him. That's not enough time, and historians agree. That's not enough time for legend to develop. It's something that they believed early. It was not developed over time. So you have this group of people who, just like Paul, believe that it's blasphemy. They've been taught it since there was a child. Hear, O Israel, the very first commandment. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. One. And that guy. It's punishable by death. It's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It causes them to be excommunicated from their community. It causes them grief and persecution, and they still believed it. Okay? You don't have to believe it. I'm just telling you why I believe it. Now, here's the story, and here, let's do this. Stand up just for a little while. Let's get some blood flowing. I'll just take a few more minutes, and then we'll quit. We'll quit, and I'll give a short answer to Marty's question because I'm afraid she might hurt me. Huh? Oh, she gave me mints. That's true. She gave me peppermints and 2 peppermint patties. See, I should have known there was an ulterior motive. She had a question. No. She's offering offering a sacrifice. Okay. Here is the story of Paul's conversion. Stephen is preaching a message. He says, telling the Jewish people, you deliberately disobey God's law, even though you received it from the hands of angels. The Jewish leaders were infuriated by Stephen's accusation. They shook their fists at him with rage, and he told them, look, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing in the place of honor at God's right hand. Stephen is saying, I'm having a vision, and not only is everything I told you about Jesus true, but look, he and God are equal. And so they put their hands over their ears and began shouting. They rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. His accusers took off their coats and laid them at the feet of a young man named Saul. Okay? That's all I want you to know. Saul was one of the witnesses, and he agreed completely. He agreed completely. I love to have these conversations. You guys are probably like, I'm so bored, please get me out of here. But I've shared now 3 different things, and I'm not listing them as I go, that I've never seen before. And I just love to do this because I learn stuff. He agreed completely with the killing of Stephen. Why? Because Stephen is saying that Jesus is equal with God. He's saying a human being rose from the dead, and there he is. He's still alive. And Paul agreed completely, yeah, we need to kill this guy. This is Paul's state of mind. Acts is sharing it, a guy named Luke. And Paul says in 2 of his letters, yeah. But Saul was going everywhere to destroy the church. He went from house to house, dragging out both men and women to throw them into prisons. But the believers who were scattered preached the good news about Jesus wherever they went. There was persecution, and so they had to leave. But they still preached the story. Meanwhile, Saul was uttering threats with every breath and was eager to kill the Lord's followers. So he went to the high priest. What high priest? The same dude that sentenced Jesus to death a few years earlier. It's the same guy. He requested letters addressed to the synagogues in Damascus asking for their cooperation and the arrest of any followers of the way, that's what Christianity was called, he found there. He wanted to bring them, both men and women, back to Jerusalem in chains. As he was approaching Damascus, Syria, he's going northeast from Israel, right? Syria's northeast. Okay. As he was approaching Damascus on the mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone down around him. He fell to the ground. There's nothing, by the way, that says he was on a horse or a donkey. A lot of times when people preach this, they'll say, God knocked Paul off his horse. He doesn't say he was on a horse. And he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Paul's answer is something from time to time, I pray this all the time. I say this to God if he exists, which I believe he does, but sometimes I don't. But Paul said, who are you, Lord?
Who are you?
It's like, okay, you've got my attention. You are bigger, you're stronger than me. You've knocked me to the ground. Let me call you sir, Lord. But he wants to know, who are you? And the voice replied, I am Jesus, the one you're persecuting. So Paul, then this voice says, now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. By the way, we find out because Paul tells this story again in Acts chapter 22 and Acts chapter 26. We hear this story 3 times. I won't tell you details of why he told it again, but it's interesting. And we find out that Paul actually saw Jesus. In this story, it doesn't say he saw him, but in Paul recounting the story later, he says, I actually saw him. And so that's the reason Paul says in 1 Corinthians, when he writes to them, he says, I also saw him. I saw him. He met me on the road to Damascus. Here you have a person who is diametrically opposed to everything about this particular message and is trying to stamp it out through violence and murder that meets the man that's in charge. That's weird. He says, so go into the city and be told. The men with Saul stood speechless, for they heard the sound of someone's voice, but saw no one. Okay, that's weird in itself. Saul picked himself up off the ground. He was blind. He remained there blind for 3 days and did not eat or drink. Now there was a believer in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord spoke to him in a vision, calling, Ananias? Yes, Lord, he replied. The Lord said, go over to Straight Street, to the house of Judas. When you get there, ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. He's praying to me right now. I have shown him a vision of a man named Ananias coming in and laying hands on him so he can see again. Here is what I know about God. God has knocked this man on the ground, Jesus, and said, hey, I'm the one you're persecuting. Could you stop that? And so go into the town. He can't see. And to sort of double down on it, he shows him a vision of a guy named Ananias. Now, I don't know how many guys named Ananias there were in that city. It's indicative of several things. These things are just interesting to me. How much God partners with humans in getting the things he would like accomplished done. Because he sends a guy named Ananias after showing Saul, hey, there's a guy named Ananias. And so he has a vision of a guy with a name tag. Hello, my name is Ananias. Coming in and praying for him. And then he goes to Ananias and says, hey, I got a job you got to do because I already told this guy you would do it. Okay? So he said, I showed him a vision of a man named Ananias coming in and laying hands on him so he can see again. Now, here's circling back to, I'm having a hard time believing. Here's a dude named Ananias who has Jesus appearing to him, and he says, but Lord, just because you don't believe something immediately isn't indicative of your character or anything bad about you as a human being. Ananias doesn't know if God has all the information. But Lord, I've heard many people talk about the terrible things this man has done to the believers in Jerusalem, and he's authorized by the leading priest to arrest everyone who calls upon your name. In case you didn't know, I shouldn't be doing this. But the Lord said, go, for Saul is my chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles and to kings, as well as to the people of Israel. This is another nail. This is another rung on my ladder of belief. I don't have a good analogy. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. This is where you have to contemplate it. Don't just read the Bible and go on, or listen to a guy on a stage on a Sunday morning and says, Jesus died for your sins, believe it, take it or leave it, or go to heaven or go to hell. Choose right now. You could die in a car wreck tonight. No, someday I'm going to slip and actually say it out loud. That's BS. That is so limiting of who God is. But here's another thing in my ladder of belief, is that here you have a guy, he's a Pharisee of the Pharisees. Later he says, the Pharisees are the most religious people of the day. I was the elite. I was the one that Pharisee, we say today, like, that's a man's man. Women love him, men want to be like him. That was Paul as far as the Jewish religion. It wasn't that he was dabbling, it was his entire existence. And so he chooses to completely reverse everything he believes, and he's a Pharisee of the Pharisees. What does the four gospel tell us is one of the characteristics of the Pharisees? Just think of, I want to show you what Paul gave up to believe. What did he have to give up as being a Pharisee?
His position.
Yeah. His image, his standing in the community. He was rich. And we learn in the four Gospels that the Pharisees dearly loved their money. They believed that their riches were a sign that they were living right. Saul is living righter than any of the other Pharisees. He is wealthy. He gives it up. I will show him what he must suffer for my sake. If there's anything that is a characteristic of Paul describing what he does after says he meets Jesus, it's suffering and persecution and homelessness and being shipwrecked and not having enough and having to build tents on the side in order to support himself. Why would anyone do this? Well, he says, I saw him. I can't change what I saw. So Ananias went and found Saul. He laid his hands on him and said, Brother Saul. He was Pentecostal. The Lord Jesus, this is one, I have several scriptures that I like better in the King James. King James says, the Lord, even Jesus, that appeared unto thee in the ways thou camest, has sent me, that thou mayest receive thy sight and be filled with the Holy Ghost. That's King James. You don't care. I have to have a little fun. Instantly something like scales fell from his sides. He got up and he was baptized. Afterward he ate some food and he gained strength. And immediately he began preaching about Jesus in the synagogues, saying, he is indeed the Son of God. Little side note, when he started preaching in Damascus about that Jesus is the Son of God, what happened to him? People tried to kill him. Remember what he went there to do? It wasn't just a thing that Paul thought, hey, let's kill some people that believe this. No, for the rest of Paul's ministry, the Jewish people tried to kill him. And one time, I believe, succeeded in killing him. Stoned him to death. Why would a person that was like that suddenly join the people that are being persecuted? Because he saw a resurrected Jesus. These are reasons I believe. Now, you've been here a long time. So here's the point where, number one, you can leave anytime you want. But if you want to stick around just a few more minutes, I want to say something else, and then I want to tell you, here's the answer to Marty's question, and we can discuss it in more detail later. All I know, I've never died. I don't even look forward to it, but I've never died. But her question is, at the point of death, is there basically a life? Are you still alive? And don't forget, we're going to come back to what I was talking about. But you're welcome to leave. We won't be a lot longer, but you're welcome to leave. Or is it, she's coming from the standpoint of a person that believes who God is, believes that there will be an eternity that we spend with him. The question is, how about the interim? I believe someday that Jesus will return. I believe there will be an eternal kingdom. I believe that somehow we will all live again. But if I die now, what happens now? Some people believe, Jehovah's Witnesses believe, for example, that there is soul sleep. It means that you sleep while you listen to Marvin Gaye. No, but they believe that you die. I always picture it like having an operation. If you've ever had an operation, it's the strangest experience to me that, first of all, they tell you, okay, start counting backwards or whatever, and you're going to go to sleep. And I don't believe them. I'm not going to sleep. It takes me a while. I got to read something for a while.
20, 19,
But then the next thing you know, it's like, boom, you're waking up and it's 4 hours later. What happened to the 4 hours? So here's what I will say first of all. When that happens, how many of you had an operation? Did you experience that, or is it just me?
Yeah.
When you woke up, did you care what happened during that 4 hour period? Did you care? Were you like, oh, I missed it? Okay, because this is the thing that bothers me about the concept of soul sleep. I don't want to wake up 4,700 years from now and all kinds of things are happening. It's like humans have evolved and they have wings with jets coming out, I don't know where, but when did this happen? I hate that I would miss that. It's FOMO for me, okay? But that's probably stupid because I wouldn't know that all that had happened. If it is soul sleep, which I don't believe it is, I don't guess I would care. And even, I've gone through the process because I'm always trying to figure out, do I believe this? Even if there is nothing, even if God doesn't exist and I just die, will I care? Well, I guess I will. I heard Rachel Held Evans was a minister that I like to follow, and she was talking to this about, no, it was Sarah Bessie. Sorry, it was Sarah Bessie. She said to her husband, I'll hate it if this, if we just die and there's nothing. And he said, it'll be just like it was for you in 1961. And she said, I wasn't even born in 61. He said, exactly. It bothers me. Does it bother you that you missed out on the Great Depression or World War II? I wasn't here. I just have to read about it. I didn't exist. Would it be the same thing? But I don't believe that's what happens because of everything that I just said. See, Marty thought Mark's talking about something else that don't matter. No, it matters because I'm establishing that this guy, Paul, I believe him. I believe him. Okay? There's substantial historical proof agreed on by people that aren't even Christians that this person wrote this and this happened to him. Okay, so I believe him. So I go to Paul and I ask this question. Hey, Paul, what happens when you die? And Paul says two things. He says three things. He says, number one, I'm sort of having a hard time figuring something out right now. He's writing to the church at Philippi. Where is Paul when he's writing to the church at Philippi? Does anybody know? He's in jail. And so he's getting older, and he's thinking, this is the end for me. They're going to kill me. Finally, the jig is up. And so he says, I'm having a hard time deciding what to do. I would like to go on and be with Jesus, which is far better. Okay? Well, me just not knowing what's going on, to me, isn't far better. He's acting like it's a place and there's a person. I want to go to this place where there's this person because that's a lot better for me. But I'd also like to stay here because if I stay here, I get to teach you. And they may have been, just like you guys, because Paul was really long-winded, they may have been thinking, no, just go on. It's great. We don't need you anymore. But he said that's far better. In another place, Paul said, writing to the Corinthian church, I'm pretty sure, you don't know, you haven't read your Bible, but the Corinthian church, he says, to be absent from the body. Now see, that's a weird concept. He in writing to the church at Thessalonica, which is one of the 7 letters that everybody agrees is Paul's, he said, I pray that your whole spirit, soul, and body be preserved blameless until the coming of the Lord. He indicates that we somehow are a 3-part being. We sometimes group spirit and soul into one thing and just call it the soul. But he actually says there's spirit, there's soul, and there's body. Those of us that went to certain churches, we learned to chant. There was a chant that we learned. I have a spirit. No. I am a spirit, I have a soul, and I live in a body. Your soul, and I agree with this, your mind, your will, and emotions. My soul is the person, this is where I have my memories. We could get into a whole discussion of, is the soul and the brain separate? I think they are. Let's don't talk about that. But spirit and soul can be absent from the body. He said when you're absent from the body, you're present with the Lord. That indicates that there's not a time period. To be absent from the body, I'm present with God. Absent from the body, present with God. The only reason you can stay on this earth is you have this earth suit. And so you can stay here as long as you have a body. When you don't have a body anymore, Paul seems to indicate your spirit and your soul will be present with the Lord. I don't know where that is, but that's where he says you will be. In 2 Corinthians, this is the last thing I'll say, then Marty can determine if she believes me or not. Paul, in giving his credentials as an apostle, because a lot of false apostles came to Corinth, he starts sharing different things. And he says in chapter 14, maybe? I don't know. In a Cambridge King James Bible, it's on this side of the page, right there. He says, I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. He said, I know a man who more than 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I can't tell, was caught up to the third heaven. Third heaven? What's the third heaven? I would say the first heaven is the atmosphere around the earth. The second heaven is the universe, the stars, the planets, and everything like that. The third heaven is wherever God is. He said that man, whether in the body or out of the body, I can't tell, saw or just heard? Saw and heard, I think, unspeakable things. It's not lawful for me to even explain what I saw. So Paul says that he went to heaven and saw things that were happening. Another place that I believe, here, leave Paul there for a minute. In Hebrews, which I believe Paul wrote, Hebrews chapter 12, the very first verse says, seeing we are, King James, encompassed about by so great a cloud of witnesses. In the Greek, it's a picture of an Olympic stadium with people that are getting ready to run a race, which they did naked, by the way, and it kind of bothers me. But so it says, just like at those Greek events where there are people running a race and there are people in the grandstand cheering them on, Paul said, because he just told about the heroes of faith who had died, David and Moses and Abraham and all these different guys, he said, we're surrounded by these witnesses who are watching us run our race. So it seems that the people who he just said had died are watching us. So they must not be asleep, they're watching us. You know what I'm saying? And then Paul again said he was caught up into the third heaven and he saw these things. And this is very interesting to me because people also will want to know, well, when I'm in heaven or whatever it is, what will my experience be like? All I know for sure, I don't know for sure, all I know for sure is what Paul said. He said, I don't know if I was in my body or not. Well, if I was see-through, hey, I don't see anything here, well, I would know, hey, I'm not in my body. But he really couldn't tell. In other words, the experience was not so different from my experience every day. When I'm in my body, I just was in a place where I was seeing such amazing things. I don't know how to describe it, and it kind of seems like I shouldn't even tell you about this because it was so amazing, and I think it's more than you can handle, so let's don't even talk about it anymore. But he's giving his credentials. All the other credentials are verifiable and valid things that I suffered. I was in a shipwreck this many times. I was beaten with rods. And oh yeah, I went to heaven. And then it just moves on. As it's one of the things. So I believe that that's what happened. So you can leave, and you probably should. Oh, I can't get to all this, so never mind. I'll get to that. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to talk about some questions next time. And I know people probably have other questions. But here's a question that people ask all the time, and then we can leave. Why should we believe any of the words written in the Gospels are actual things the historical Jesus said when the first Gospel wasn't written for almost 40 years? Number one, that's not true, but okay, I understand what you're saying. Two of the others use that one to make up about 70% of their text. This is talking about Matthew and Luke using Mark. It's not an uncontested fact, but okay. And Paul didn't quote any of the quotes of Jesus that we find in those Gospels. And he was writing in the 40s and 50s. His point is, if Paul is writing, he's actually writing in the 50s. In the 50s, and he doesn't quote anything from the Gospels had to have been written later, so that's time, like I said before, for legend to develop. Okay? We'll talk about this next time. But Paul quotes Luke. So we'll talk about that. What this question is, it's a great question, but it's not completely accurate in its assumptions. Okay, I'm going to show you why I'm convinced the Gospels were written much earlier.